attending. Really appreciate it. What we did was we put some emails and surveys out, and we asked people to submit questions so that we could be a little bit more succinct. But I thought what I would do is go through a few of the things that are there. And we're going to talk about the mandate timeline, what's really in the mandate at a top level, who's affected. Then I want to make sure, because it seems like a lot of the pre-questions that came in were centered around short haul. So I want to go through what is the short haul exemption, what's the 16-hour exemption, and what about these 30-minute break allowances for short haul. And then we're going to answer questions that we received prior to the seminar. Not that we won't get to questions that were submitted. And I always start these webinars with a little glossary so everybody's on the same page. An AOBRD, that's the current regulation in place. And the ELD does not start until December 18th, 2018. EOBR was an interim term that really isn't being used at all anymore, so we're kind of throwing that to the curb. FIPS is a security method. FMCSA, I'm sure everybody knows, is Federal Motor Carriers. NIST is, if you look at that one, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That's another security thing we'll have to go forward with. PKI is another thing that we use, and many people have seen these certificates, but they beefed up the security pretty well on this regulation. So the timeline, the actual regulation was issued on December 16th, and the compliance date is 2 years after that. So the compliance date is, the actual date is December 18th, 2017. That's the point at which time no AOBRDs can be sold after that point, or no AOBRDs can be installed or purchased after that point. However, there's the grandfather clause, as everybody calls it. So if you put an AOBRD in your vehicles prior to December 18th of 2017, you are allowed to use that AOBRD until the final date when everything, whether an AOBRD or an ELD, have to be fully compliant to the regulation in December 2019. So there's a 2-year grandfather grace period or clause there that said AOBRDs installed prior to December 2017 can be used till December 2019. So anything installed after December 2017 has to be fully ELD compliant. So this other timeline is one that I've received from FMCSA on some of their presentations. Apologize, a little hard to read, but basically it's showing that what they're looking at it is awareness, different phases as they call them. So with the ELD final rule, and they actually have an incorrect date here, but there's a 2-year period of awareness when they're getting everything ready so that enforcement training is in place, awareness of FMCSA and all DOT people that would do audits. And then the phase-in of compliance means, you know, you're going from AOBRDs to full ELD all the way out in 2019. So what's really the top level things in this regulation? One thing that people keep asking questions about in presentations I give in some of the webinars is this regulation does not change hours of service. It doesn't change your 60 and 70. It doesn't change 11 hours of drive and 14 hours of duty or 10-hour breaks. All the hours of service that are there now for oil field or federal rules stays the same. What happens here is there is a very large technical update since this regulation was first published in 1989. You can imagine what technology was available then as opposed to what it is in 2016. So there's significant technical updates. And Omnitracs and XRS actually sat on the MIXAC committee that helped input into these technical updates. It addresses harassment in my terms, maybe not the right way to say it, but harassment was what postponed everything handed down by the U.S. 7th District Court. And what it has done here is, and many of you may have known this or have heard it, but they're giving a significant amount of control to the driver on editing the logs, auditing the logs, and not allowing edits to even come from the back office that a driver doesn't approve. And they also updated a 15-year late legislative action and got very specific on supporting documents, and that even to the point where even certain mobile documents, like loads being sent, certain communications of a driver, can be construed as a supporting document, and there has to be 8 supporting documents within a 24-hour period. And the security was updated significantly, and I mentioned some of that where they're using NIST as a government standard, they're using FIPS, and the FIPS publication 197 is there, and PKI. So that's to protect any data being transferred from an ELD and any data that's on that ELD. There's a more formal certification process, and that certification process, when I say is formal, many people may have seen that there's a few devices registered, and there's a given number of documents that you have to submit describing the product, what the product looks like, user guides and things of that nature that have to be submitted. Realize that this is still self-certification, and that certification is not done by FMCSA. So the point of fact here, I guess I'm saying, is it's still buyer beware, it's still supplier self-certified, it still has to go through it. They put a very significant test document out there that they suggested we go by to certify against ourselves. And there is a challenge process, so that if somebody feels that a product that's been given a registration number, again, there could be some vetting. There's been some articles about this written lately. There could be some additional vetting by FMCSA, but up to this point, that hasn't been put into place. Information electronically transferred or enforcement has never been done before, but in this regulation, the 8 days of detailed logs and events that are there will be transferred to enforcement at roadside through several different methodologies, one being telematics, 2 different methods, and one being peer-to-peer. So who's really affected by this? So any driver who's required to keep record of duty status. People argue about, was it 3.1 million, 3.7, 2.9, pretty big number. It includes drivers who keep rods more than 8 days, or break rods more than 8 days in 30, meaning if it's a short haul and you don't comply to the short haul regulation more than 8 days, you'll have to do that also. It includes rental equipment. You know, people ask this very frequently about short-term rentals. This doesn't affect leasing companies. It doesn't affect whether it be Penske, Ryder, you were on, or anybody else that's the national lease that does leasing, right? Not to single somebody out, but they're not really directly affected. So if a carrier has a 3-day or 4-day or a 2-week rental, even though that whoever that driver is that has to keep record of duty status, at this point is still required to have one of these. The exemptions come from the fact of a vehicle manufacturer manufactured prior to 2000, so the last 4 digits of the VIN number have to be less than 2000 to get the exemption. This was their answer to the mechanical engines. So if the truck doesn't really have an ECM, and I know there's some 96 Internationals out there that may not have one, but there are other vehicles prior to 2000 that do have an ECM, and you could still put an ELD in them. It doesn't say you can't. It just says, according to regulation, you don't have to. Now, drive-away and tow-away, provided the vehicle is part of the shipment, meaning, you know, I'm sure people have seen, you know, where a tractor's going on the road and there's 2 tractors stacked on the 5th wheel in the back, and they're being towed and taken somewhere, or just a tractor by itself. You still have to keep record of duty status whether you don't have an ECM or whether you're a drive-away or a tow-away. And if rods is used less than 8 days and 8 and 30, then you're exempt. So what I thought I'd do is go over what is really in a short haul exemption, right? So to run short haul, you must begin and end at the same location each day or tour of duty. You can't be on duty more than 12 hours, and you have to have 10 hours off between shifts. The time clock has to be maintained so you can understand that there's some mechanism to indicate the time started and the time stopped where you came in and out of the location. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the terminal, but it's the same starting and ending location. You still can't drive more than 11 hours, and you still can't have weekly more than 60 or 70, and you must be within a 100-mile air rule. So if you break one of these in a day, that's where they're coming on that you must keep rods at that point. So that would count one of 8. The other thing that people use under short haul is a 16-hour exemption. Doesn't necessarily have to be short haul. There's carriers that run a short haul system, but they'll work over 14 hours. But they will always come and go from the same location. They don't exceed any of the short haul criteria. But when you do and put a 16-hour exemption in, that's another day that you would be required to keep record of duty status, detailed record of duty status, even if you broke that for that one day. Excuse me. You can't use this, and when you do invoke this, by the way, and you do it, you have to return to the same location you started at that day, and for the 5 previous days or 5 previous duty statuses, or tours of duty. Sorry, apologize. The 5 previous tours of duty must be the same location. So it just can't be I'm here one day and I leave and then I was at different locations before. No, that's why they call it a short haul exemption. Not more than once in 7 days unless you incur a reset. You must be discharged by the 16th hour. It doesn't extend your drive time, only duty time. So if this is invoked by a driver, they may have to make sure that they have the drive time left to use it. Rods must be maintained the day it's invoked, and this part is really not available to the non-CDL short haul. That's sometimes referred to the 150 air mile. So there's another part where the short haul exemption on a 30-minute break, right? And people sometimes think it's just, okay, no problem. But if the short haul exemption was broke prior to the 8th hour, and this came out in a guidance in the Federal Register, then you must get that 30-minute break in before you continue to drive. Now, if the short haul exemption happened to be broke after the 8th hour, right, but you must take that 30-minute break before the 14th hour and comment why you weren't able to take it. And all this, as I said, came out of the guidance in the Federal Register. It may not be posted directly under the FMCSRs or the guidance, but it is there. So now I wanted to get into some of the questions that were posted before the seminar or the webinar was put on. So people asked, and I shortened them because some of them were long, but keeping track of on-duty time when not in the vehicle, and we've had this multiple times. Well, what can happen here is the regulation didn't take away from the back office edit. So when you still have a back office edit, an administrator, they can put in on-duty time that way, all right? And that would come through an edit. Driver would see it and accept it or reject it. No reason the driver wouldn't accept it. Then it would be entered into the log. Now, since the requirement going forward on an ELD requirement is that editing capability is there, then to enter all this on-duty time while not in the vehicle is capable for the driver to enter that on-duty time through the editor themselves with a comment of what they were doing, maybe working in the shop, maybe they were working on the dock, maybe they were doing some paperwork. So when drivers do edit, it's probably advisable for a comment to be made so people understand it, and that most likely will be there as a standard process. I use the term slip seating because we got several questions that went along the lines of, well, if driver A works half day in a shop and then he takes this other truck and driver B is driving versus driver A and they switch off during the week, each individual driver has to have a very specific login. And what would happen in those circumstances of what I call slip seating is the system would synchronize all the hours from the previous 7 or 8 days down to when that driver logged in, because being specific driver, password, and user code, then it would bring all the data back to that driver at the time they log into the vehicle. So if you had 3 drivers, using that truck, 3 different logins, they would bring their own information back and keep their logs whole, right? And how long do I need? And how long do I need an ELD? When you get this 8 days and 30 thing. So basically, what happens is the question, as it was posed, and I oversimplified it here, is that if I break short haul and I break those 8 days, the way it reads is they're going to have an ELD there for the remaining 30 days. Now, my suggestion to people is that if you're going to run short haul and break it more than several times in 30-day cycles, you may be wanting to think that short haul might not be the right thing to do, because you're still going to need to have an ELD in there. Then there's other systems, the way we do it. We allow the short haul to break over into long haul type federal rules. So that's another opportunity can happen. And one question came in is, can I flag a pre-trip to not go on duty? Well, anytime you do a pre-trip in a vehicle, you're on duty. That's a pretty specific definition. So pre-trips and post-trips are absolutely on duty time. So driver works for 2 different carriers, and there's 2 different systems. Well, the way they addressed that in the regulation, and they didn't make it as part of the regulation, they made it as a suggestion, is that they talked about having a thing called interoperability. And what interoperability their suggestion was that the enforcement transfer file would be populated, and that supplier X would import the file from supplier Y between 2 different systems. So to try and clear that muddy statement up is, if I would do something that would look like an enforcement transfer, but not an enforcement transfer. Create the 8 days of logs with all the detailed on-duty status and all the detailed events, and generate a file that would look like the enforcement file. Then the other supplier would take all that detail in and build a log out of it into the dissimilar system. That's a pretty challenging activity, and I think that's why FMCSA did not make it a mandatory requirement. Wait time if livestock carrier or other. There are livestock exemptions right now. There's exemptions for livestock carriers on 30-minute break and things like this. So the livestock rules and those kind of things are what they are. So as I said, it doesn't change hours of service, right? There's questions for agricultural products. Well, states have agricultural rules, and if you're running a state ag rule, like California has them, and I'm sure Texas has them, and a few other states, you're running those agricultural rules, and you have to understand and make comments that you're running ag rules. So that was there. Now, the Canadian transition from U.S. to Canada rules, and really I think the way the question was asked was, if I'm in Canada and I'm going into the U.S., what's the requirements? Well, there are some cooperative agreements, like on driver vehicle inspection reports between Canada and the U.S., but the way it's working is that when you're in the U.S., you got to adhere to the U.S. rules, and when you're in Canada, you got to adhere to the Canadian rules. So there's nothing that indicated that you couldn't have paper logs if you were a Canadian-based driver coming into the States, all right? But if you're a U.S.-based driver going into Canada, many of the systems already kick over into the Canadian rule set, so that carriers wouldn't have to worry about that. So with that, I guess I would like to go to Austin, and the questions we have would be why some people use 150 air mile for short haul exemption. So that 150 air mile rule is for non-CDL drivers. It is not for a CDL type driver. And there's similar requirements for that, but it's not as strict on the 12 hours of duty time. But that's what that answer is for that question. It's non-CDL drivers get the 150 air mile rule. If you're CDL, it's a 100 air mile rule.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Here's the next question we have in the chat. So I have a driver who works in the shop about half the time and is on the road about half the time. He fills in his paper logs every day as on duty as when he's in the shop. How will he do that with ELD when he is in the shop for a week and then goes on the road?
Well, here's the thing is, when we get to this December 18th, you have to have an ELD. Up to that point, you're in this transition period on ALBRDs and paper. So when you get to the point where an ELD is absolutely required, meaning December 18th of 2017, then you're no paper anymore. So what you'd have to do is use either the driver, use the log editor to enter the on-duty time for the previous 2 or 3 days or 4 days, or that they could enter the on-duty time through the editor and push it down to the driver to accept it. So there's 2 methods right now that I'm suggesting that you can do to accomplish that.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, we frequently pull hopper bottom and we sit in harvest and meat packing plants for long periods of time. How will this affect me?
Well, I mean, if you sit in a packing plant for a long period of time, this discussion comes up quite frequently, and it doesn't matter, what type of shipper it is. If you're hazmat and tank, you don't really get to necessarily all the time get to be relieved of duty from the vehicle, which can put you into an off-duty status. If you're required to stay with the vehicle and maintain that vehicle, it's on duty, unless you can work something that is auditable and correct to be relieved from duty on the vehicle. Otherwise, like I said, you're required to maintain with the vehicle either because of load, because of circumstances, or because of facility, then you're still on duty. It's not an off-duty measurement. I know that a lot of people don't necessarily care for that answer, but if you read in the definitions under 395.2, any time with the vehicle, behind the wheel, working for the carrier in any form is an on-duty time, if not driving.
All right, that's all the questions we have in the chat. If anybody else has another one, go ahead and put it in now. Otherwise, a reminder, we will be sending out the recording for this in about a day or so. And I want to thank everybody for getting on our webinar today.
Yeah.
And
I
we
can
have
answer
one
some
more.
things that keep coming up, Austin, that frequently in the webinars that I have are, people ask very frequently about gliders, and I'm not sure if people on the call use gliders at all. But a glider is a very heavily modified vehicle that could have a 2000 or 2001 vehicle with a 1998 engine in it. All right. So what happens is, if the capacity plate on the vehicle says that it's 2000 or newer, it doesn't matter what engine's in there. Right? If somebody put an engine in that vehicle that didn't have an ECM, that's going to be a tough thing to handle. Right, so I suggest make sure that people that have gliders take a look at that circumstance to make sure that the vehicle is older than 2000. I know that there's certain type carriers out there like auto carriers, because it's a very expensive superstructure to put around a tractor, that they have tractors prior to 96. So, and I would guarantee most of them do not have an ECM. So that thing keeps coming up all the time.
Okay, so next one here is, Are there any specifications with regards to how or where the ELD should be mounted?
Yeah, yes there is, and they talk about it in 2 respects. So there's fixed-mounted devices, and even if it's a fixed-mounted device, like some of our product line is designed that way, and then our XRS line is designed on a mobile platform. But when the vehicle is in motion, mobile or not, even if it's a fixed mount where you can clip it out, the device has to be mounted while the vehicle is in motion so that the driver is capable of seeing the screen. We still can't have the driver interact with it while it's in motion. right? Can't do duty status changes while in motion. Can't do, keyboard hits while in motion. That's supposed to be locked out. But when you're at a roadside inspection, the device must be able to be viewed by enforcement without enforcement entering the vehicle. So, even if it's not tethered, you have to be able to hand it to the window that enforcement doesn't have to open that door and get inside. Now, mobile devices, as they're going down the road, and I've had this question, well, if you can't use them while they're going down the road, why do you have to mount them? Well, there's one thing in the regulation that says that if the vehicle is stopped for up to 5 minutes, which, by the way, is the only auto duty status, you're allowed to display a message to the driver, do you want to remain in drive? And you display it for a minute, and if they don't answer it, then you put them on duty, right? But they have to be stopped for 5 minutes. But that message has to be seen by the driver, or how can they react with it? So I think that answers the question of the mounting requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. So is it mandatory to allow drivers to edit their own logs?
Yes, it is. It's if I go through some of the driver control specifics, what they have is that the driver has total control over log editing, so they can do it. And if a back office edit is pushed to the driver, that back office edit can be rejected by the driver. Just because the administrator in the front office or back office edited, they can't just automatically apply it until the driver reviews it and accepts it with some comment. And there's another piece to this where they put driver control, and we didn't mention that, but it's in some of my other sessions, is there's unassigned vehicle moves, and they can come in different variations. Driver just forgot to log in and he moves down the road, a mechanic took it out for a road test, any of this thing. Those are also would be presented to the driver, and the driver would have to be the first one to accept or reject those unassigned vehicle moves.
All right, so how long can a driver be in a rental unit while using paper rods?
0. There's a short, sweet answer. If the driver is required after December 18th of 2017 to keep record of duty status, then that vehicle would be required to have an ELD in it. It doesn't. They came out, and we had Joe DiLorenzo at our session in Outlook last January, and he made comments on it also. And Joe DiLorenzo is from FMCSA at director level, and when I've gone through this regulation and other presentations, so I just recently did one at Arkansas, is that question comes up, and if you're a 3-day rental, 2-week rental, 1-month rental, if the driver is expected to do rods, he's supposed to have an ELD in there as of the December 18th date. There's not a free give there at this time.
All right, so as long as we are short haul under 100 mile air miles, we do not have to have an ELD, but keep paper logs still no matter what the year of the truck. So could you elaborate a little bit on the 100 air miles rule and whether that would require you to have an ELD or not?
Yeah, let me go back here. So this is the requirement, if people can still see this, on short haul, right? Every one of this criteria must be met to qualify for short haul. So if you meet these and you don't break them, then you don't even have to keep record of duty status. Short haul does not require keeping record of duty status either. But the time clock is essential. So this time clock thing in bullet point 3 has to be maintained, indicating the start and end duty time at the facility you go in and come out of. So that makes it that I can prove I was there for 12 hours of on duty, and when I clocked out, then my 10 hours of off duty starts. And you can't come back on duty until that 10 hours is elapsed. So as long as you meet all this criteria here, you're not required to keep record of duty statuses, nor do you need an ELD. Well, let's go back to that 8 and 30 discussion. If you break short haul with any one of this criteria, more than 8 times in a 30-day window, you will have to have an ELD in that vehicle for that 30-day cycle. And then your cycle starts over again. That's the way it reads in the final rule.
Right, so is there a yard mode feature to save drive time when shagging trailers?
Yeah, there is. Yard move came in, and what a yard move is, it's not a duty status. It's an event. And FMCSA put probably 8 or 9 different events in, yard move being one of them. So it's a manual event that the driver puts themselves in, a yard move. They can run around the yard for 3 hours, 4 hours, moving vehicles around or whatever. It will only be counted as on-duty time and not drive time. Now, FMCSA still has to fix some guidances, because if you look at question 9 under the guidances, it says that even time in a private yard is on-duty driving. But because of this, we're allowed to do a yard move, and the suggestion is, and I get this question quite a bit, yard move is for private property, right? But guidance still have to be repaired in documentation in FMCSA. It is not, as FMCSA verbalized it, you can't use yard move at a truck stop, only in a carrier area. And there's no distinction of when a yard move ends. That has to be a manual event by the driver to end the yard move. But most likely, well, not most likely, what we'll be doing is we'll put like a 20-mile-an-hour indicator to warn a driver that they're at 20 miles an hour and they're in a yard move. That's just to make sure nobody goes, out of the yard, run down the road at 50 miles an hour in a yard move, and then they have to make edits. Because if that happens, the driver will have to stop, do the appropriate edits to indicate the drive segment, and that the yard move was not as long as it was.
So if I install an ELD, do I have to use them right away, or could I continue using paper logs until December?
Well, you could still use paper logs till December. This is where, if we go back into, I guess, the FMCSA chart, where they said this is an awareness and a transition period. So when you look at December of 2015 until December of 2017, that's the transition period where you can still do electronic logs that aren't ECM. You can do an AOBRD. If there's an ELD out there, you can use an ELD if it happens to be compliant. Be very cautious of that. And then you can use those 3 methods until December of 2017. And at that time, any new device or any device being used that has not been an AOBRD implemented has to be an ELD.
All right, so next one up is, if a driver wants to go grab a bite to eat while on a reset, he cannot unless he goes on duty to do a pre-trip. Therefore, he has to start his reset all over again. Can another driver or maintenance do a pre-trip and him sign off?
Well, if you have teams, so this is a pure operational use case. Let's say. So if you have a team and somebody has to do a pre-trip, all right, somebody can put themselves in an off-duty 30-minute break to go get lunch because they need that 30-minute break because they've been on log for 8 hours of on-duty and drive time. But now you're switching from primary to secondary driver, so operationally, technically, yes, could this happen? Operationally, you have to take it into consideration so you don't suck up the wrong hours.
All right, so do you need a mounted device, or can you use an iPhone or Android app?
You can use an iPhone or Android app that's electronic logging until December 18th of 2017. At that point, that app that's just on an Android or an Apple unless it has an engine control module that it's talking to and hooked to and getting it in the engine information from, you cannot use a standalone phone app after December 18th of 2017. It has to be synchronized with the engine to be compliant, plus all the other technical things and everything else that's in there. So I guess that might have been the last question for where we are now, Austin. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the last question we have in the chat. I'll give you all another couple seconds to put anything else that came to mind. Otherwise, if you think of something after the presentation, you can email us at webinars@omnitracs.com, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as we can.
Well, thank you all for attending. I hope you got something out of this and greatly appreciate it. And I guess we'll have another something in a few weeks from now, right, Austin?
Absolutely. We have another event on June 20th where we're going to follow a very similar format to that. So keep an eye out for that registration page out on our website. And if you have another question, we will do our best to get it answered in that one.
Yeah, and I think what I'd like to do is also steer people to our ELDfacts.com website. It's on the screen right now. We've put a substantial amount of ELD information, white papers, webinars, voiceover webinars, all kinds of information that it's really related to the ELD mandate. And our marketing team has done a just stellar job on putting this information together and getting it out there. And I think if you go there, it can answer a lot of other questions that you may have. So again, thanks very much for attending.
All right, thanks everyone.